This is session number 4 of the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the Behavioral Observations podcast. I can't believe we're at session number 4 already. This has been quite a ride for me, even though we're only 4 sessions into this podcast experiment. And I'm really happy to report that over 3,800 people have downloaded and listened to episodes 1 through 3. So I'm really pleased at the response. And a lot of you have kind of reached out to me through the contact page at behavioralobservations.com and provided some really nice feedback to me, and I really find it helpful and certainly reinforcing as well. I've also gotten some cool reviews on iTunes too, and I wanted to just give a quick thank you to folks like, these are some funny handles, if you will, or screen names, Midwest ABA Geek, L. Brown, Emmett, BSD, Bruce, and Zulu, I think, if I'm reading that correctly. And I know others have reached out as well, and I just kind of want to thank everyone for their support. You know, if you do have a minute, these reviews and ratings in iTunes are really helpful. Right now, the Behavioral Observations podcast is ranking in the new and noteworthy section of the social sciences category in iTunes. And for those of you who aren't perhaps podcast geeks like myself, that's kind of a big deal. And what it means is that the podcast is getting a little bit of free publicity and things like that. So if you want to help with the dissemination effort, take a couple of minutes and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It's just takes, like I said, a couple of minutes, and it really helps get the word out. Also, I know lots and lots of you are just kind of spreading the word more organically or in an old school way, and that's great as well. That really helps. So again, I want to thank everyone for the support and the feedback that I've been getting with regard to the launch of this show. With regard to this show, I'm really psyched to share the conversation I had with this particular guest. She wears so many hats. I think she said something like she has 7 jobs, and I don't know how she keeps all of them straight, but she is the owner of a consulting company. She is a tireless advocate and has been deeply involved in licensure legislation, and we talk a lot about that. She has been a pioneer as it relates to the use of social media in the world of applied behavior analysis, and so many other things. I'm probably forgetting quite a few of them. So she is none other than Dr. Amanda Kelly, or you might know her better as the Behavior Babe. So in this episode, we talk about some of the more recent legislative issues that are going on in Hawaii. We talk about how she got from one end of the country all the way out to Hawaii. You know, in other words, we talk about her journey as she developed as a behavior analyst. We talk about the use of social media as behavior analysts and what are some good things to think about when we are on the internet and using Facebook and Twitter and so on and so forth. We also talk about, you know, kind of what the day in the life is like for someone who does have 7 jobs. I mean, I can't really fathom keeping all those things straight, but she certainly does do it, and apparently does it very well. Before we get to the interview with Dr. Kelly, I do want to talk a little bit about our sponsor today, which is bsci21.org. bsci21.org is an ABA news site with hundreds of articles connecting behavior analysis to our world in a non-academic format. You know, I'm looking at their site right now, and I'm just going to read some of these headlines quite literally verbatim. Let's see. Miami ABA's Tech B conference to feature robot-delivered ABA services. Let's see. Dreaming with Skinner, how Walden 2 continues to inspire big thinking. Do theory and philosophy even matter? Using prevent, teach, reinforce to safeguard children and teens from pornography addiction. And so on and so forth. So that kind of gives you a sample of the diversity of topics that they cover. And what I like about them, kind of going back to what I said a minute ago, is that they discuss these topics in a really kind of non-stuffy, non-academic format that nonetheless frames these ideas up in behavior analytic principles. So go ahead and check them out when you get a chance. It's bsci21.org. That's bsci21.org. And without any further ado, let's hear from Dr. Amanda Kelly. Hey, Dr. Amanda Kelly, thank you for joining me today, or should I say aloha, I suppose might be a more appropriate greeting. Thanks for joining me today on the Behavioral Observations podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me. I mean, aloha, of course, would be a much more localized greeting, for sure. It means hello and goodbye, so we'll use it in this case to mean hello.
All right, very good, very good. Is there another more suitable term, or is that pretty much cover it?
I feel like there's more formal versions of that. Maybe if you're just kind of taking a walk on the beach, you might say, how's it? Sort of like, what's going on? Yeah.
Okay, cool. How's it? Okay. I was hoping to get a little bit more, kind of local lingo. So I'll keep that in mind if I ever get out that way. So, local lingo aside, I'm really glad you had the opportunity to join me today. You've got some happenings going on in Hawaii that you've been very active in, and you've not only in participating in, but also disseminating through your various social media channels. I'd like to give you an opportunity just to kind of explain to our listeners what exactly is going on out there with some of the legislative issues and things like that, because I think it probably provides some cautionary tales for the rest of us here on the mainland.
We do have a lot going on legislatively. Last year we passed our autism insurance as well as a licensure bill. I think there's a lot that every state can learn from the states that came before them. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, we were the 42nd state to implement autism insurance. And so looking at and having some education and training through the Association for the Profession of Behavior Analysts, as well as the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, the BACB, on where a comma goes, where a comma doesn't go, the difference between the words and or, can be really critical. This year, what we're seeing is an implementation of those bills.
So would you say the and or and the comma, like in terms of actually writing the legislation itself, is that what you're...
Yes. So we looked at the model licensing acts that were available through our affiliations and organizations, the BACB and APBA. But really you have to look at tailoring things specific to your state and looking at the culture and the climate and the other stakeholders that you're working with. So we had these sort of broader discussions on the importance of and ors and commas and thes versus we's or she's. Just that specificity can change the complete intention of a law. And I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a background in law at all. I'm a behavior analyst. I'm an educator. So what we're finding this year in our implementation is that there's a lot of confusion, or it allows room for interpretations, which is not what you want when you're trying to improve the quality of service. Right now, that means that we are currently back in the state capitol trying to clarify and revise our licensure law. So our autism insurance law seems to be going off pretty well. The companion bill for licensure has a few hiccups, and just sort of how does that pertain to all facets of our state, like the Department of Education as well as adult services.
I see. And is there something going on that talks about perhaps letting other people get in on the behavior analysis game? I recall reading something like that, where basically, what exactly was that legislative endeavor that you had written about it? And it was, you're nodding your head.
Well, I mean, there were so many separate initiatives that it's hard for me to think about which specific one. We did one last year where we were able to pull in the broader community, where we used sort of the local language, Malama Arkeiki, which means to care for our children. And we use that as a social media campaign to get behavior analysts, to get families impacted with autism, to get the community, the more global community, as well as people across the 8 islands participating. And that was just a matter of like holding up a photo or holding up a picture. What our licensure says now, and that was very helpful in getting us the attention, getting the legislators to see that the community was involved and that they cared. It was a low response effort for the community. Hold up a picture, smile, show that you that you support this message, and then send it to us, via Facebook or email. It was incredible. We had people from Dr. Dick Malott to just pets and chickens and surfers, everyone in so many different places participating in that campaign, which I think brought larger attention to our initiatives, and Hawaii in general just tends to be forgotten about. It's a wonderful place to visit, but it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, quite literally. When we are looking at our licensure law, the thing that's so interesting is that we stated that people who are directly implementing services have to be overseen by somebody who's licensed, and that's not very earth-shattering, seems like common sense. But we also stated if they are providing behavior analytics services, they have to become registered behavior technicians. And that passed in our state. So we are looking at how do we make every single individual who's implementing a behavior analytic behavior plan, how do we build the capacity for our registered behavior technicians in the state?
Wow, that sounds like quite the monumental task. How is that? How do you go about doing something like that on a statewide level?
Well, it was really helpful that when our law was signed, it was last July, it was before the exam requirement for registered behavior technicians. So that enabled us to encourage the community and the behavior analysts to get going and sort of credential a bank of RBTs prior to the year starting, so that we had a reservoir to start with, and then we could work on building the capacity as we continued forward. Where that leads us now is the discussions with the Department of Education, the Department of Health, on how do they build capacity? What are the numbers that they're talking about? And so we're working on those figures. And we've been able to partner with universities, and our hope is to offer a free RBT training, at least the 40-hour piece of it, broadly in Hawaii this summer.
So how are the schools respond? I mean, I have to imagine most of the behavioral analytics services are carried out in the school settings, and or at least that's a guess. If it's not, please correct me. But I'm just curious about how the schools themselves respond to having that kind of new responsibility of kind of manufacturing, if you will, or mass producing RBTs on that scale. Are some school districts doing better than others, or I'm sure it must be kind of a mixed bag. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Right now, actually, the majority of services in Hawaii historically have been provided on the island of Oahu. So Hawaii is made up of 8 main islands, the state is. And the reason why a lot of the services were restricted or limited to Oahu is because Oahu has the military bases. So that means that the TRICARE funding was available where the military are living. What that produced was, I believe, like 4 behavior analysts in the entire island of Maui, which is much larger in size than Oahu. So with the implementation of our autism insurance, as well as now Medicaid services covering ABA services, what we're seeing is that behavior analysts can now work on neighboring islands, and families on neighboring islands are really starting to access these services. What we don't see is the Department of Education does not have internal capacity. So for any of these types of services, maybe called a different name prior to last year, they were contracting out. And so we're looking at do we have enough contracted individuals, which we believe we do, to meet the needs right now? And then how do we help those systems build internal capacity, which we think is just an ongoing discussion and process.
I see. It's just fascinating to see how different states are handling these things. Out here in New Hampshire, it's there are some school districts who are getting staff trained up as RBTs, and but it's that piece of it's kind of slowly developing. Of course, more slowly than we'd like. So, anything else, kind of systems wide out in Hawaii, you want to kind of let us know about?
Oh gosh, there is so much. I think it's really important that, with legislation, things are really time sensitive and they can change on a day-to-day basis. What we have found to be the most helpful, I think, is a unification of the behavior analysts who are living and practicing locally, which means a lot of communication because everyone has a different experience and background and wants to bring their voice to the discussions, which we totally support as a state chapter, which I'm, part of HABA. Hawaii Association for Behavior Analysis here.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's been really amazing to see the way that we've built relationships with the community and the process we've gone through with educating the community about behavior analysis, about what these services might look like, about what funding sources could be, and that we've just been sort of constantly available, which is tough because this isn't our jobs. This is our volunteer sort of side adventures, and they can be, really kind of time consuming. But we certainly believe it's for the right reasons, and we do believe that with everybody working together, which we think we're getting much closer to on a statewide level, we think we have the ability to really impact the lives of so many, which is the ultimate reinforcer.
Yeah, for sure. Do you know approximately, and if you don't know off the top of your head, that's fine, but do you know about how many, I went to Mass ABA last year, and they were talking about how Massachusetts has the highest per capita population of BCBAs, globally, if you will. What is it? How is that density playing out in Hawaii? Are there, kind of a handful of BCBAs running around there, or is it a growing community? I'm not. I mean, of course, I can go on the website and look it up, but I'm just curious what your perspective is of a growing community, or at least I imagine to be a growing community.
Yeah, when you have increased funding sources, when you have increased need, when you have increased awareness, then I think we're going to see an increase in these numbers. I've lived in the state of Hawaii for 2.5 years, and the number of behavior analysts has nearly doubled. We are now looking at, as of yesterday's figures, it looked to be about 125 to 129, depending, because those results are still kind of adding up the more recent certificates, which is an amazing number. I moved to Hawaii from Massachusetts, so I was one of the 2,000 and some behavior analysts there, and I often look to make comparisons because I knew coming to Hawaii it was a very different situation. The weather is much, much nicer, but the state of services was in a really dire in a dire place. Although we're making so much progress. When I look at the number of BCBADs, for example, in Massachusetts, there are 110, or there were the last time I checked, and I said, wow, that's about the number of total behavior analysts Hawaii has. So there's some comparison there. For our doctoral level, we really have very few. I believe there's about 5 of us, and that's because we don't have a local doctoral program, I think, and I think that hopefully we'll look to change that in the future and see more people either move in or extend their education here in Hawaii.
Cool. Yeah, we've seen that growth here in New Hampshire. In fact, we just had our first annual New Hampshire ABA conference a few weeks ago, which was the folks who put that on just did a terrific job. And, of course, as you see this in different presentations by either heads of organizations or heads of state chapters, there was the obligatory graph of the increasing number of BCBAs over the years, and I think we've probably grown quite a bit over the last 10 or 15 years or so. I think I moved to New Hampshire in 2004, and I think I was one of maybe 10 or 15 BCBAs at that time. And, we have, well into the hundreds right now. So, but again, nowhere near as populated as Massachusetts. So, but I'm glad you brought that up. I guess this is an kind of a fortunate segue. I'd like to get a little, kind of backstory in terms of, how you got from one end of the country all the way to the other. Can you talk a little bit about, your course, your professional pathway that kind of led you to being out there in Hawaii?
Absolutely. I'll talk about the professional course, but I think also a lot of it had to do with a prolonged state of deprivation. I was, enrolled in my master's and doctoral program in Massachusetts, and therefore wasn't able to take family vacations or trips with my friends with such flexibility as many others could. And so ultimately when I graduated, I was going to take an opportunity where I saw one. But as far as professionally, I was doing my undergraduate degree in West Virginia. I was living in Maryland at the time and picked a local school. So it was Shepherd's College at the time. Now it's Shepherdstown University,
Mm-hmm.
moving up. And I did a degree in elementary education. I wanted to be a teacher. During that time, I saw a flyer for working with a child with autism. It says, "We will train you in ABA." This is something by this guy, Lobos, and won't give you the exact year, but it was still in the 90s. And so I felt amazingly fortunate that here I was at 18, 19 years old, and there's this part-time job looking for only 6 to 10 hours, perfect for the super dedicated undergraduate student that I was, or maybe slightly the slacker at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked my professor, "Hey, what is autism and what is ABA?" Because I don't think they spelled out ABA in the flyer, and I didn't know what either of those meant.
Right.
And
It's a Swedish rock group from the 70s or something
yeah,
like that.
it's yeah, the American Bar Association. It's for lots of different things. And she said to me, "Autism is just like Down syndrome, and ABA is that horrible thing Skinner did."
Oh my gosh.
And fortunately, I never really much found my beliefs to be aligned with this professor. So I kind of took it upon myself to investigate what it was for this family. And I went and met the family, and they were just truly such an amazing unit that I thought, whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. And I ended up working with their son for 3 years, and they had a company that they flew down from New York at the time. There were no consultants in the area. The BACB was just being formed. There were no BCBAs.
Mm-hmm.
And to think in West Virginia, a child who had just turned 2 had a diagnosis and a prescription for services. And we're talking 16, 17 years ago. And yet we're still arguing and fighting for those in so many places. But once I graduated, I no longer felt fulfilled in being an elementary education teacher solely. I said I want to do applied behavior analysis. And I found only 2 job postings in the United States. One was the Morningside Academy on the West Coast, which my mom said was too far. Obviously, I'm much further now.
Right.
And the other one was at the New England Center for Children in Massachusetts. And that's what brought me to New England, where I stayed for 11 years.
Oh, wow.
You know?
That's pretty cool. So what's been the biggest challenge, just I guess from, I guess it must not be too much of a challenge given the weather differences, but just in general, what are the things that you've noticed that are I guess culturally different? Of course, this is probably a conversation that could take us way off track, but just, if you can give us kind of like the Reader's Digest version of, some of the differences you've seen.
Yeah, so many things are different, but in a lot of ways, I find all these parallels. In Massachusetts and Hawaii, it's an expensive place to live, so you have family units that live together. You have extended families or people who build up on. Here they're called ohana houses, ohana meaning family. So it's interesting what that does to a community and culture. If you have a child, maybe who needs some services, the family may be more inclined to take care of that themselves. They may not seek outside help. Things sometimes here are private. We have a lot of the Asian culture here as well. So we have a lot of different things to consider when we're going in and working with families or schools. And it's important to take a step back and realize, who are we talking to? What are their needs? And how can we meet them where they are? But I feel like those same guidelines ring true in many different locations, no matter who we are and who we're working with. I think things that can be challenging as far as just collaborating with the mainland, which is what we call the rest of the United States, is just time zone differences. It can be really hard. Hawaii does not honor daylight savings time. It's great. I love it. But the rest of the world, most of the world does, which then makes everyone just one more hour out of our reach. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. People think about vacationing, but oftentimes they don't think about the resources. You produce your own electricity when you're on islands. You are responsible for things like not overpowering the system. So there's not a lot of air conditioning units. That does play into irritability and behaviors in classrooms. And so all of those things come into play differently in different places, but it's been really interesting and important to be really mindful of here as well.
Is there, and I have to imagine that there's, the and we see this in New England, of course, I do a lot of work in rural communities in New Hampshire and Vermont, and some of those communities are very different than, say, the Ben and Jerry's postcard that you get from Stowe, in Waterbury, Vermont, and I would have, and so there's a lot of like rural poverty and things like that. Do you guys have a lot of issues as it relates to those factors as well?
Absolutely. When we are looking at pediatricians who can diagnose or things like that, we're talking about somebody has to get on an airplane and be flown to another island. When we are talking about having a person come and meet with you in your house, well, that depends. Is the volcano actively erupting through the main road, which is not something I ever had to consider in Massachusetts. I don't have to really consider that on a daily basis because I live on Oahu and that is occurring on the island of Hawaii. But there is only one BCBA on an island that has 100,000 population, an island the size of all the other islands combined and then some. So when I talk about Hawaii, it's important for me to not only think about the island I live on, but the neighboring islands around me. So we have a neighbor island representative on the HABA board to make sure that we never lose touch with the neighbor islands, sort of what is going on for them. I think also, you do. You have people who live off the grid. So maybe they produce their own water. And when you're working on maybe just toothbrushing, that changes everything there too. So,
right, or toileting.
Toileting, absolutely. And so it's important to know organic gardening, farming, hands-on is very important here as well. So you have a lot of local pride. And so when we look to educating and advocating with the community, we want to do so in a way that will increase the pride of the community to take care of everybody. And then we also say, we're working to help individuals give back to the community. And what is that going to look like as well?
Cool. Excellent. That gives us kind of a nice overview of how things are going out there. And it's just a personal fascination of mine because I've always wanted to go to Hawaii and never have. So it's maybe just me being nosy more than anything else. But I appreciate taking the time walking us through what's going on out there and all the hard work that you guys are doing from an advocacy perspective, as well as all the other stuff you were talking about. I do want to switch gears and talk about your, I guess for lack of a better word, your alter ego, Behavior Babe. So I'd like you to tell me the story of how you developed this I don't know, persona, if is the right word, or how did you hatch the idea?
Sure.
Yeah, tell me how this all got started.
Well, I was joking with another behavior analyst friend this morning, and I said, it's funny when people refer to Behavior Babe as her, or when they're talking to me as if she's an additional person. And I said, well, I guess it's appropriate because I'm a Gemini, and we had a nice chuckle as the perpetual behavior analyst and us were skeptics. But I think that it's not uncommon for me to want to find multiple ways to talk or to communicate. I feel like that's a strength in an area I find reinforcing. But it really originated for me, the website is what started, and it started before it was called Behavior Babe. I was working in a public school system. I was consulting and coordinating some classroom supports, and I received an injury on the job and was out of work for an extended period of time, and they weren't able to replace me, or they didn't replace me in those classrooms. So you have students and teachers who had service, who were really resistant to behavior analytics support initially. We had a year together. We saw great progress. It was amazing, and then the injury occurred. And then I had teachers emailing me, asking me for data sheets, or, hey, I made this one, or I started taking ABC data, and I was thrilled, so excited to, hear from them. But I was prohibited from providing them materials or from working because it was a work-related injury, and that would constitute working while on workman's comp. So there's a sort of red tape, if you will. So I was researching a few things. I was on my couch for several months. It was a shoulder injury. I was actually enrolled in my PhD program, so nothing better while you're in that program than to procrastinate on all of your assignments.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And while doing so, I created a private website. And on that website, I created data sheets and templates and operational definitions and started trying to make videos that I could find. Technology has advanced so much in the last 8 years. It's phenomenal. It makes things much easier for me to disseminate this and for others who are doing it as well. But then it started to build as a place, a resource. And I was, reading about functional analysis. I'd start throwing article links there. Or I'd say, oh, you know what, let me see what I found here. And here's some samples or handouts or materials. Started compiling what ended up being just a wonderful resource. And I gave these teachers password codes to log into it. Yeah.
Cool. Did you code your original, or was WordPress, or what did you, just out of, this is probably not germane to most of the people listening, but just just out of pure personal curiosity, how did you set up your first website?
I use and still continue to use freewebs.com. I don't code. I had practiced a little bit of that in the MySpace era of things, but it was a lot of work. And so high response effort on my part didn't produce as quickly the results, the immediacy that I was looking for. So freewebs.com is how we run the Hawaii ABA page as well. I think how the dissemination of behavior analysis SIG is still using that platform possibly. So what I like about it is that anybody can kind of learn to go in and just, it says here, click here, add a picture, click here to add text. Mm-hmm. To learn the formatting and the font, some of that kind of stuff. It takes a little bit of playing around with it, but it doesn't take a degree in computer programming. So I found that to be really helpful. After a while, I realized the website would be more useful, I thought maybe to other people as well. And I was mentoring individuals pursuing their BCBA. And so I started opening up the website for things like that. I then took down the password and started making it nicely presented. And then it was 2009 ABA. We were all going to ABA International, and Twitter had just kind of come into creation. And everyone says, let's tweet about the conference as part of the dissemination special interest group. But we had guidelines, how to appropriately tweet and not disrupt your presenter and what the hashtags. I don't even know if we had hashtags originally. Mm-hmm. But all those guidelines, and everyone had to come up with a screen name or a handle. And everyone was beating me to the punch. There was, Misbehavior, which I still love that name. Behavior Guy, Corey Robertson. There were others as well. And so I was like, okay, behavior girl, behavior person, lady, data driven, and ultimately just landed on behavior babe. Put it together as a screen name handle, and then later rename my website because ABA-MA, which stood for Applied Behavior Analysis in Massachusetts, actually was leading a lot of people there who were searching for Obama instead of Obama, mm-hmm. Which I used in my favor. I started putting things like, how could behavior analysis help in the White House? Using those keywords to bring people there. But it's much easier to remember Behavior Babe. It's a way to brand. I'd like to say it was all intentional. I've learned a lot. I think I could help set up things moving forward. But it's sort of just evolved in this organic way.
Wow, that's a neat story. I've always, the whole idea of branding and coming up with that sort of thing has always fascinated me. So just out of curiosity, how many social media platforms are you on right now?
As Behavior Babe, I have Pinterest, Twitter, Facebook, the webpage, an email. I don't use Instagram for Behavior Babe, so I would say definitely a handful. There had been Tumblrs and other things that haven't seemed as popular anymore.
I see. So that brings me to another question. Given the I guess the plethora of social media outlets, and given the lengthy experience that you have in a lot of these platforms, what advice do you have for behavior analysts as kind of we use these sorts of things? And to be perfectly honest, I'm still very, very new to a lot of this stuff. I kind of got into a lot of, got my Twitter and Facebook and all that stuff up and running in service of creating this podcast. I was kind of like a Luddite, and I think my mom has been on Facebook longer than I have. So can you talk a little bit about, what are some things that we should look out for and things like that?
Yeah, it's an area that I've had a lot of experience in, and I'm interested in kind of continuing to refine and learn about, So, for example, there's different platforms, different ways you can use social media. I think it's very helpful if you have disclaimers or statements on your about page or things that start with, I am not your consultant, or this is general advice, or this can be freely disseminated with appropriate citation. That's something that I've listed on Behavior Babe, freely disseminate. I think that that's really helpful. If you state that you are going to be providing only behavior analytic information, or if you're going to be providing something more broad, I think it's important to give that overview. I also think when we look at Facebook, for example, there's the ability to use secret groups, there's the ability to use closed groups or sort of clubs, and then there's open access Facebook pages such as Behavior Babe. Mm-hmm. I think for me, I don't utilize a lot of the restrictions on those pages. Like, I don't have to review posts before they go on my wall. I don't have to review comments. I have a lot of trust in the people who participate, and I've only ever deleted one comment in the 6 years that I've had the Behavior Babe Facebook page, which is quite amazing. I think, of course, there can sometimes have spammers or other things, but in general, I think a lot of that was antecedent and cultivating that sort of climate and what will be accepted and what is discussed, and giving people a place where I hope they feel safe to share their opinions. The secret groups are really excellent when you have like a board of people who need to talk to each other quickly. Mm-hmm. So the Hawaii Association for Behavior Analysis uses that for our legislative committee because it's easy to communicate in a really quick and timely manner. With that said, it's called a secret group, but a disclaimer, nothing on the internet is secret, ultimately. So I do think that's something we need to think about. When we are looking at sharing information about clients or having questions about consumers, or maybe a photo from something at our clinic, I think it's really important to think about what that individual would think when they are 21 years old. And sometimes we get permission from parents, we get consent, but we don't really think of assent. And I think to the best of our ability, we should be definitely considering that. An article I co-authored was called Blurred Lines, Social Media and Ethics, and I think that's a great place to go and look towards for, we're not saying that you shouldn't be online. As a matter of fact, I'm saying you should be. Mm-hmm. But what should we be on there asking? You could almost replace behavior analyst with doctor. Would you feel comfortable if your doctor went online and described your weird rash and asked fellow physicians what they thought they should do? Probably not, So when you take it outside of our own experiences, which can be really helpful perspective to have, because we're trying to be helpful a lot of the times, but we're unintentionally really getting ourselves in pretty murky water.
Yeah, you can go down a few rabbit holes on a lot of the ABA Facebook groups. And, and I sometimes, most of the discussion, I would say, or, a large part of the discussion is more inquiry based, people looking for resources and things like that. And then there's, the occasional, something like you just described, where it's there might be a very, detailed question or something like that. And I hadn't thought about the analogy to physicians or it could be dentists or whatever other, kind of health practice that's out there. That's a pretty good way to kind of frame up how that might look.
Well, and Facebook also shares a lot of information about you that you may not be aware that you're sharing. So, for example, one of my affiliations says I am a K school counselor, and it pops up. So when I left a comment on a local news station, it came up as my school counselor affiliation. So that's just something I needed to know because I had logged in through Facebook, and that's the one that it had decided to use. So if somebody can deduce where I work or what island I'm on just based on the About Me section of Facebook, then my post may not have added too much information. But in conjunction with what's already publicly available, I now have potentially violated confidentiality or HIPAA rights. So it's oftentimes really unintentional. And so part of that other part of what I would say is, how do you repair mistakes that have been made? And that's really what we need to, I think, prevent, and then look at how do we repair any damage that was potentially unintentionally done.
I see. And what would be an example of a repair strategy, if you will?
Deleting certain posts might be a good way to go so that it's not publicly searchable, at least readily available. As I mentioned, if it's posted, it may potentially always be out there, but you can kind of minimize its public reach. I think adding any clarifying statements that might need to be in there. Preventatively, I'd be looking at, we don't need to get a consent to talk about somebody on an online social media platform, because we shouldn't be doing that. If we want to be reaching out to somebody on a social media platform and ask them to talk to us offline and reach out to them as an expert, then that would be appropriate. And we might use that as a way to get a hold of somebody that geographically isn't convenient. And that would probably require an appropriate consent to do something like that. I think it's a matter of really knowing your boundaries and where the violations are, and preventing future ones from occurring.
So I would imagine that there is the opportunity for, depending on how you have your settings set up. And again, I am so not versed in this, so jump in at any point when I inevitably screw this up. But I suppose depending on how public or private your I guess your personal settings are, that probably opens the door for either families or other people that you work with to kind of connect with you that you might not necessarily would do so in the first place. And I would imagine there's the potential for a lot of kind of boundary violations.
There absolutely is. Dr. Mary Jane Weiss has given great advice around this. The online platform should really be viewed as no different as an in-person or interfacing with somebody live. So, there is somebody reading those comments on the other side. That is somebody you're actually working with, that you're describing in those posts. It's not as anonymous as we are led to believe it is, because it's easy to have so many online interactions. So I do think that's really important, a really important piece as well.
Are there any, I know we're kind of talking about Facebook and things like that, but do you have any similar caveats for using Twitter or anything else, or is it kind of along the same lines? I mean, a lot of it sounds like kind of like you use common sense, put yourself in the and again, I'll reiterate that I do like that idea of kind of imagining what it would be like if your doctor was doing having these types of interactions with his or her colleagues or what have you. Does anything change across these different social media platforms, or are these kind of more or less universal rules as you see it?
Yeah, I feel like they really are universal rules. I think when we're looking at the use of the hashtags or tagging somebody in a post, it's really important to make sure that you're doing that with the right permissions or considerations. If somebody is posting something publicly, though, then it's publicly available. I think that does give us some freedom to share and discuss. I encourage behavior analysts or anybody, as a matter of fact, on these social media sites to be very appropriate and courteous as much as possible when we're interacting. A lot of times things can get misunderstood, and when things are being typed, we're all familiar with having misread a text message or an email.
Sure.
Imposing our own tone that we're, the mood that we're in. The same is true for social media sites. Before I ever get really upset about a comment or an exchange, I often will reach out to that person online or separately and say, hey, can we have this conversation separately or somewhere else? And sometimes what I'm going to find is somebody's just trolling the internet and they don't want to talk about what I'm talking about. And that's pretty easy to detect. So in those situations, I just don't allocate any behavior, and I don't have to worry about the payout there. Place it on extinction.
Sure. So, we talked about some of the pitfalls. What are some of the, looking at the other side of the coin, what are the opportunities, with the use of social media that we have as behavior analysts that perhaps, we might not necessarily be exploiting right now?
Some of the benefits for me have been the ability to connect with people like you, Matt, to be able to say, hey, let's do a podcast. And
Sure.
We had a ton of in-person, interactions. I think I've been able to do research with people who I, again, would have never connected with. It's amazing to have been involved with the information age or the internet and all of the social media sites at the time that we were, as our field was also exploding. I think it allowed behavior analysts to walk into this, as many of us, even if we didn't grow up in a way with these tools, to kind of immediately integrate them in with our professional work. And that's where it can be dangerous and harmful potentially, but also where it can be really helpful. What I've seen so many other Facebook pages or groups or people writing blogs. And every time I see one, I get real excited and I read it and I say, oh, that's great quality, or that person's coming from this excellent perspective. And then I disseminate it and share it as broadly as I can. I think our ability to work together as a community and to continue to embrace what behavior analysis can change and impact will allow us to be amazingly effective disseminators of our science. I feel a shift in my own perspective of the sort of tone and attitude of behavior analysis. I think a lot of that has to do with all of these ongoing conversations, maybe here locally in Hawaii, and perhaps I'm speaking more locally, but there's not a lot of confusion about what is behavior analysis. Maybe all the different ways it could look or all the applications that there could be. Certainly we're still having those conversations, but it's almost accepted as fact in some places that ABA is the way to go for some, maybe autism or autism-related services. And that's amazing. And I think a lot of that has to do with our research, with our staying true to being scientists, and with our disseminating that science through our social media sites.
Cool. So the last thing I want to talk about is it seems like you got a lot of cool things going on with your own practice out there in Hawaii. Do you want to talk about? We've talked about your advocacy. We've talked about the social media stuff and the kind of development of the behavior babe persona and whatnot. But we haven't had a chance to talk about kind of your consulting practice and some of the other things going on. So what's your day job, or what's your day-to-day look like?
Well, it's quite incredible. I have about 7 jobs, I believe, 7 paying jobs, I believe, as well as the volunteer nonprofit HABA and other related boards that I'm on. It's wonderful that the weather here is 99% of the time lovely. So if I am working on a Saturday, 4 Saturdays in a row, I will carve out a Wednesday for myself when I can. I started my own consulting practice, and I definitely caution people from doing that. It's a lot of work. It's very hard, and it's not where my heart is. My heart is in working with clients, working with the direct level technicians who can be implementing, working with teachers and parents. I don't really care to do the billing and the payroll and the taxes, but I have, because as I mentioned, there really weren't a lot of options, and when I relocated here, it became the best option for me. I felt like I was very fortunate. I have my doctorate in behavior analysis. I know the climate and the culture in which I was coming in. I was coming in having been trained and surrounded by many quality behavior analysts in New England, and it was still very, very difficult. What I enjoy about it is the flexibility, are the families. I have a parent participation clause. Doesn't mean you have to sit there through every session, but it says we're going to do this together. And being sort of the executive director and the founder of that consulting business, I get to make those rules and have the quality that I was trained to expect, which means I service only a few clients. Really I do. So I have right now about 3 clients that I'm seeing on an ongoing basis. One of them is through military, one of them is through private insurance, one is in the DOE, Department of Education public school. We have some private school. So I feel like it's just enough to keep myself current with sort of some different issues and how children or adults even are accessing our services. I also do the global autism exam prep for the BACB. I've been, for that exam that I've been doing for a couple of years. It's not for the BACB. It's for people who are taking their exam, of course. And that's been a really rewarding experience. I originally was really hesitant. I was like, I don't want to train people to pass a test. I want to train them to become great behavior analysts. And I realized that I'm a piece of maybe being able to train them. So really what I do with that 2-day review is it's a matter of fluency and looking at how do we break it down to daily concepts and maybe make connections that weren't made in some people's training. Sometimes they say it's because they did it rushed, or they took their classes a while ago, or they were doing it online. Different things for different folks. Some are amazingly skilled behavior analysts, and I can tell that from an online call, but they have test anxiety. So sort of informally, I guess, I've been helping people with test anxiety, which I only know a little bit about. I also have done some marketing work for Relias, and so that is online. I had done some recordings for them in the past, and I think it's high quality product. So
For
I will
those
have,
who, excuse me, just for those who don't know, can you tell us about Relias?
sure, yeah, absolutely. So Relias is an online platform. It used to be the ABA section used to be Autism Training Solutions. So you might be familiar with some of their CE videos or their supervisory training. They did the agency. They were then acquired by Relias, and they are now able to access and impact a much larger range of people. So nursing, home health care, geriatric patients. And so the original founders of the Autism Training Solution are now really working out and helping Relias understand the applications of ABA to other areas. My role in Relias is much smaller. It's in making sure that what goes out on our ABA side is accurate and not in violation of any statements that the board needs us to comply with. But I would say everything I do is always behavior analysis. And to me, that's okay, because behavior is anything that any living organism can do.
For sure.
And analyzing it does start to become second nature at times. Often people will say, "Are you analyzing my behavior?" And I'll say, "I don't know. Are you going to give me a paycheck? Like, do we have a contract? Am I on
Is there
the clock?
consent?
I'm analyzing it to the purposes that I need, but unless there's a problem, there's really no need to intervene." So it's full. My schedule is full, but it's in a lot of ways very flexible, and it allows for travel and going to a lot of conferences, which I enjoy.
Very cool. Final question. I would imagine that you would probably have a lot of these conversations, giving your exam prep work and things like that. Do you have any advice for someone who is either just sitting for the exam, or just this is timely because of a lot of people just are getting a lot of good news, so for that newly minted BCBA, do you have a piece of kind of parting advice?
I would say for any behavior analyst, I highly recommend that you volunteer or that you get immersed in the community. Show that you have something to give that's not just our advice about the science. I think it also makes us more rounded as people, that we see individuals in different situations. I would say develop that verbal community. If you didn't have one through your school program, or maybe not at your place of employment, online platforms can enable that to occur, especially in remote locations. I know that Pooja, for example, is a BCBA in Kenya, and was able to do that through using the use of online access to other experts. I would also say, never stop learning. Dr. Benjamin Witz just published a blog, I think, about that, saying the perpetual student that we should all be. I highly encourage that. I stand corrected on a near daily basis, perhaps sometimes. But try to do so as humbly as possible, because, I say to people, the Verbal Behavior Milestones Assessment and Placement Program, the VBMAP, wasn't released by the time I had started my doctoral program. That's how quickly our field is evolving and changing. So you have to stay on top of it and ahead of it to really kind of be the best behavior analyst you can be. All
right. That's sage advice from the Behavior Babe. So thanks for taking some time to come on the podcast here and share your thoughts.
No problem. Thanks for remembering about these 8 islands here out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and recognizing that, yes, there's behavior analysts here too. And it's great. It's great to talk to you, Matt. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks. Take care. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Amanda Kelly. I will have some contact information in the show notes. So if you go to www.behavioralobservations.com and then scroll down to session number 4, we'll have all the contact information. But if you're impatient like I am, you can say how's it to her at Behavior Babe on Twitter. She does tweet quite a bit, so you can kind of keep up with things that are going on in her world by following her on Twitter. And again, that's at Behavior Babe. Her website is behaviorbabe.com. And for those of you who are students and aspiring BCBAs, you can go to globalautismproject.com and find out all about their exam prep materials and training programs that she does. And just to kind of wrap up from what I started out with, if you have any feedback for the show, for example, if there's topics you want to hear about, if there are guests you want to hear from, just head over to behavioralobservations.com and click on the Contact tab and drop me a note. So until the next time, folks, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to this podcast. See you later.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.